evening world. Let's just wait a bit. Some people to come. People are leaving in droves, aren't they? Anyways. Okay. So the talk tonight is The Apocalypse of the Subject, which is a translation of a talk I gave last year in October in Berlin at a conference that I organized together with Leszek Stalewski, a friend of mine who's an author and lives in Berlin. And I translated that text today from German to English. And it was a bit eerie to see that it was quite prescient, in fact. So let's see what the talk is about. To begin a path of the spirit always first requires gathering of oneself, a gathering that neither attacks what is at stake, nor prematurely frightens it off, nor fancies itself that it is already clear and obvious in advance in which direction, which path thinking may take when thinking takes on a phenomenon. This thinking, which is attempted here, does not want to proclaim anything, nor prove anything, and above all, such thinking does not want to be correct and to present correct and informative facts or topics or opinions. If anything, then this may be an attempt that speaks from a secluded realm, the realm of that which the German vernacular calls Geschichte, in which this which is Geschichte shows itself. That is to say, if this attempt succeeds, then perhaps we might gain an insight into that which is in our epoch and what is at stake in it. Hence, this thinking must necessarily have already set itself in relationship to that which is, but it must also speak from within a realm that does not correspond to the prevailing formation. Such thinking draws furrows in the delusions of the self-aggrandizing late modern subject and points to the abyss from which said subject emerges, unseen. In this sense, this thinking is apocalyptic, insofar as the Greek apokalyptein means to discover, to uncover, to expose. Mortal thinking is apocalyptic thinking, insofar as the mortal being always begins to think from the end. Yet thinking is not imagining or representation, because representation or the imagination is historicizing, securing, and ultimately calculating, arbitrarily rearranging images in order to secure for itself a future a priori. That is to say, representation and the imagination do not know of a radical breaking open, an opening or revealing, for representation always already operates with images and with pastiche. The late modern subject moves along straight lines, where it deems to know everything always already and in advance. One knows the numbers, the figures, the models with which we operate this planetary spectacle. Everything is always already known. Even the ultimate destruction of the planet has already taken place in the frenzied imaginations of the subject. Utter collapse is the last absolute certainty of the subject, which finds itself in this moment at its utmost maximum extreme of itself. Unless, of course, the subject were finally to gain control over the imaginations of nature, so that, in the best case, nature itself finally becomes a product, and no one dies who ever has to suffer again. The painless, deathless environment, for which no human being will ever be good enough, which the imagination is dreaming up, is therefore, as is proclaimed, a post-human and transhuman world, although it remains questionable whether the word world will then still be valid at all. Whoever hears the word apocalypse presumably imagines the end of the world. It is important to emphasize that here, as always, the imagination, Reflexion, Verstandeslogik, itself, of course, wants to take charge immediately. Of course, it is conceptually and historically correct to connect the word apocalypse with these representations, as they seem to emerge from the last book of the Bible, for example. But as is well known, the last book is called The Revelations of John, or in German, Die Offenbarung des Johannes. Something is revealed to the evangelist. Something discloses itself. What then is meant by the dictum, the apocalypse of the subject? What is meant by this title? What is addressed here? And to say it again, as I have said elsewhere, the apocalypse of the subject is also what is addressed when I speak of the collapse of Gestell, which has nothing to do with machines. Apocalyptic representations and frenzies all seem to operate in a similar way, namely with a linear understanding of time, with an end that will concretely occur, and by which everything will come to an abrupt end, and all of a sudden, a new world is set to arrive. Apocalyptic imagination reckons, firmly calculates with the end, and calculates precisely the exact occurrence of the end. But at the same time, always already installs hedging techniques and protects itself against collapse with insurance policies. Apocalyptic thinking, on the other hand, thinks towards a turning that arises from within itself, such a turning which swings against itself and opens up other realms. That is what the ancient Greeks, what the vernacular called catastrophe, catastrophe, which means that which turns and bends within itself according to its own law. The catastrophe, the catastrophe, comes to the forefront in the tragic. It occurs, the catastrophe occurs at the moment when the hero's destiny is decided, according to how the hero responds to the world, explains himself and justifies himself to the world, and how he responds to his task of fate. Of course, tragedy does not mean that the hero has made some unfortunate wrong decision, and that one could have averted or ensured or even would have had to avert any misfortune if one had only made the right choice, as if man existed in a metaphysical supermarket in which one could choose arbitrarily between options. The tragic, rather, is the endurance of that which cannot be solved. It is the entering into the full eruption of the impossibility of any way out, and at the same time, the carrying and bearing of this very impossibility. The catastrophe, this deep turning, gives us nothing more to solve, nothing more that mortals could somehow avert. It is the moment when the mighty, the enormous, appears in the world. The Greeks called this to denon. And the German vernacular knows the word unheimlich, that which finds no home in the world. But when this enormous, that which terrifies, appears sensibly, which the English vernacular calls eerie or weird in an old sense, which cannot be engineered, which cannot be controlled or willfully brought about, then an opening has always also betided. The genuinely weird can never be planned for, optimized for, and its bursting in occurs only when something secure has already begun to evaporate. Afterward comes weird, an old English saying goes. Late modern man, who, qua subject, thinks, believes, deems himself to be in control of the fate of the entire planet. After all, we live in the Anthropocene. Kant could not have formulated his Copernican revolution better. Late modern man knows of catastrophes and even tries to control them. In English, the word catastrophe was first recorded, to my knowledge, in 1748. Catastrophe, as we understand it, thus seems to be quite a modern concept. And amongst other things, then it stands under the sign of the Faustian will to power, and this also means a will to destruction. It seems to be significant that this word, catastrophe, resurfaces again late and retains its meaning of the unforeseen turn of tragedy only in a very reduced manner, if at all. How is catastrophe represented today? How is it understood? A catastrophe is legally defined as that which occurs when all of man's security apparatus and safety measures and systems suddenly lose their effectivity. They're suddenly no longer effective. There are here, of course, also very precise definitions at work for legal and insurance reasons. What matters in a catastrophe, as we define it, is not how many people die relative to the disaster. Rather, what matters is by how much, by how late, how much time has passed until the rescue services arrived. When the sinister side, shall we say, the weird side, the eerie of the world is revealed, and not all the defense machines and apparatuses are immediately on the scene and present to avert that which is also always there in the world, then we can legally speak of a catastrophe. And this is important for the late modern security subject and its paranoid delusions, because then the catastrophe is a neatly defined insurance claim and can in this way still be secured against. One is insured against all risks. This means that even if the eeriness, the uncanniness, the weirdness of the world suddenly appears for a second, the abyss that once was called chaos, opens up. Even this can still be capitalized on. There is assurance, reassurance, insurance, and the secure is still intact. However, here no turning, no true catastrophe has betided, namely, which would mean that the horrible is flashing through. Modern man is the man of positivity, and that means Gesetztheit, positiveness, namely the positiveness and positing of the parameters within which late modern man finds, rather invents, his scientific insights. Positivity also means givenness, namely the givenness of all phenomena purely according to the usable relationship in which we stand to the objects in their representational state. The prevalent representation of nature as a resource goes by the name sustainability today, as the circular repetition of the securitization of interchangeable resources for the sake of optimizing and increasing the circular production of energy. Another name for sustainability then would be cybernetics. Cybernetics is a positive circuit that permanently reaffirms itself again and again. Some have argued that modernity is but one single positive feedback loop. Of course, but cybernetics actually functions according to a dialectic. Without negative feedback loops, which are entirely consumed in the positive feedback loop of cybernetics, the permanent feedback loop cannot work. Negative feedback, for example, criticism inherent in the system, makes the system stronger, anti-fragile. One could perhaps also say, without one or the other, secured against catastrophe or imagined supposedly irreversible doomsday scenario. Without this, there can be no critical system, and ergo no capital. Maybe I should say this again. Without one or the other, secured catastrophe or imagined supposedly irreversible doomsday scenario, there can be no critical system, no capital. The positive needs the negative, to speak bluntly. Negativity is the driving force of the positive feedback loop that is called cybernetics. There is no exit here, for capital itself is exit. It can only be hinted at here that obviously exactly this process is described by Hegel, probably rather unconsciously, pun intended, in his Science of Logic, where negativity is the driving motor. Negativity is the driver of the logic, as death is that which allows life to become full, as Hegel argues, in the phenomenology of spirit. Thus, Heidegger says in his notes on Hegel, that in Hegel, despite the focus on negativity in death, everything seems already strangely secured against. Heidegger writes, but with this death in the phenomenology of spirit, it can never become, but this death can never become a serious threat. No catastrophe is possible, nor is any downfall and subversion. Everything is already unconditionally secured and accommodated. And on negativity in Hegel, end of quote was this, and on negativity in Hegel, Heidegger writes the following about absolute philosophy must enclose negativity. And that basically means not to take it seriously. And this is maybe how cybernetics works. Perhaps that is why Marx thought he could see the future through his readings of Hegel. What is communism other than a strange apocalyptic cult that believes in the coming of the end times, in the kingdom of man on earth, without worry, hardship, catastrophe, tragedy, and ultimately perhaps even without man? Negativity, Heidegger sees, is consumed by spirit in Hegel's thought, but not taken profoundly seriously. And that is to say, the negative, the deinon, is not allowed its own course in its own right. But if something suddenly began to show itself, which could no longer be secured against, something invisible perhaps, how would the late modern subject respond to this? How, if the eerie, the most terrible, something invisible, slowly began to determine our trajectories again, without any will here being strong enough to rebel? Something as small as a virus, without any calculating, being capable of coming to lend us support. What if the imaginations, the representations, the paranoid ideas of the late modern control subject were slowly to turn into utter paranoid delusions? If all of a sudden nothing seemed obvious anymore. On the one hand, the end of the world has, of course, already been calculated with complete certainty and many times over. Newton was not only a natural philosopher, a metaphysician in his own right, but also one of the first mathematicians of modernity who calculated the precise end of the world. Today, there are scientists who have with absolute certainty calculated when the sun is set to implode, and this planet will go down with this implosion, they tell us. What might this be other than scientifically disguised nihilism? What is it about modernity and modern mathematics that it wants to calculate the end of the planet? And at the same time, of course, we are marching ever more gloriously towards an ever brighter future. We're getting better and better, and we ever more gloriously also triumph over history and nature, or so we tell ourselves. Now, anyone who can read can see that the thinkers who determine modernity have often spoken of horror, of the most terrible thing that announces itself. In the Anthropology, Kant speaks of boredom as the horror vacui. Modern man must be permanently afflicted and affected in order not to encounter a horrendous emptiness that would eventually throw the late modern subject back upon itself. Note also what Hegel writes in the preface to his Phenomenology of Spirit. This is Hegel, a long quote. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, a qualitative leap, and now the child is born, so the spirit that cultivates itself matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structures of its previous world, whose instability is indicated only by isolated symptoms. The irony in boredom that infests the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, are heralds of approaching change. The irony and boredom that infest the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, are heralds of approaching change. This gradual crumbling that did not alter the physiognomy of the whole is interrupted by the sunrise which, like lightning, all of a sudden reveals the contour of the new world. End of quote from Hegel. Heidegger then was the thinker who at last had to think through this gradual crumbling, das allmähliche Zerbröckeln, and see how everything was to be secured for all times according to the godfathers of modernity. But this has led to this gradual crumbling, which we are now pushing to against its utmost maximum. So much so that even experiences are now offered for sale as pre-formatted services. So much securing have we tried to establish. Everything becomes an event, but nothing betides. Everything is improved and optimized, but the good, capital G, does not show itself. Anyone who is honest hears in all these hollow idols only the sultry halls of emptiness. The hidden goal, Heidegger writes in Contributions, to which all this and other things are hastened without the slightest suspicion or inkling, is the state of utter boredom. We must, of course, note carefully that each of these thinkers, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, understand boredom quite differently. Nevertheless, it is only in the age that calls itself modernity that boredom increasingly appears as an emptiness to be avoided, as senselessness. The temporality thanks to which we are thus seems to have emptied itself. What Heidegger then sees is that the entire apparatus that modern man has erected around himself serves only for boredom. That we are building an economy not of desire, but, if one takes a closer look, this planetary spectacle economy is an economy of boredom, which uses boredom as its fuel in order to goad on desire. In such an economy of boredom, the subject must be constantly affected with new stimuli from without to react to. The overstimulated subject, who idolizes itself to be the absolute ground of things, the fate of the planet after all, must at some point lure itself to believe, or actually fall for the most extreme stimulus from without, because nothing still could affect it. And that utmost, most extreme stimulus from without is the promise of its own extinction, which it fantasizes about. At the same time, however, another delusion seems to emerge here. The late modern subject, which to itself is omnipotent, loses itself in the self-deception precisely because it no longer believes the certainty of its own existence and slowly is starting to realize that it is not omnipotent and self-made. The doomsday fantasies that fuel the economy of the consumer-producer caste today are characterized by the last certain knowledge that there are not enough resources. These fantasies arise from a lack, not from a lack of available resources, but from the lack of meaning, from the assault of nothingness, which hardly anyone wants to get involved in. And I've said elsewhere that the will to will that's operative in this epoch is itself fundamental lack, which it tries to overcome. This last knowledge of the late modern subject, which is still certain for the late modern subject, which is that resources will run out, that nothing will ever be enough, that ultimately nothing can be secured forever, is in some twisted sense a knowledge of the last things, insofar as the last things qua resources are soon used up, as the calculations and models show. The simplistic, from which an abundance could sprout, could spring, never shows itself to this subject, for it only knows lack, and it only strives for more power for that reason. That means it always acts with violence against beings, and always acts out of its fear of emptiness. We are of that age that calls itself the modern age. It is a strange time to live in, or put it differently, to live in an age that gives itself a name. In German, this age is called Neuzeit, new time or new age. Why is it that this epoch gives itself a name? Why is it that this epoch calls itself new, modern, late modern, as I've said, which means of the present moment? Which new time is dawning here? Are we ready for the dawning of a new age, or do we only surrender to an historicizing and so on, in which the same schemata are negotiated and rehashed over and over again? If it is true that something sinister, terrible, weird is beginning to show itself, I will say it again in brackets, that I gave this talk in October of last year. So if something weird is beginning to show itself, despite our attempts to calm ourselves, perhaps, then it will be time to take this sting seriously. Mark Fisher concludes his book Capitalist Realism with this sentence: from a situation in which nothing can happen suddenly, anything is possible again. Now I'll read now from a quote from Michael Grant's book, The Fall of the Roman Empire. There was no room at all in these ways of thinking for the novel, apocalyptic situation which had now arisen, a situation which needed solutions as radical as itself. The status quo attitude is a complacent acceptance of things as they are without a single new idea. This acceptance was accompanied by greatly excessive optimism about the present and the future. Even when the end was only 60 years away and the empire was already crumbling fast, Rutilius continued to address the spirit of Rome with the same supreme assurance. End of quote. That man is mortal. This may give us a hint toward the dimension where true catastrophe, a turning, can betide. How do we respond to what is announcing itself? What stance can we take? There is, it seems, only perhaps one possibility, which is an attitude or a stance that Nietzsche calls the Halcyonic stance. In his text, The Case of Wagner, Nietzsche writes, "What we Halcyonians miss in Wagner, la gaia scienza, the light feet, wit, fire, grace, the great logic, the dancing of the stars, exuberant spirituality, the shudder of light of the south, the smooth sea, perfection." In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche writes, "The halcyon-like, the light feet, the omnipresence of malice and boldness, and what else is typical of the type Zarathustra, has never been dreamed of as essential to greatness." Zarathustra feels precisely in this extent of space, in this accessibility to the opposite, as the highest kind of everything that exists. Now, have we heard him? Zarathustra comes into his own when he becomes aware of the opposite, when he does not repel or rebel against it, but lightly, by dancing with wit and gentleness, faces the most adverse. The little ice-bird Halcyon waits for the smooth sea in winter, while the storms for a couple of weeks do not disturb the sea for a short time, so that this little bird may breed. The Halcyon knows of starvation, of the tides of being, and benignly awaits the moment when the festival of birth announces itself. Thus, says the Halcyonian Zarathustra, "I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I say to you, you still have chaos within you." To be able to bear this chaos, the abyss within oneself, the emptiness and the nothingness, the indissoluble tragedy at the heart of human existence, death itself, that is the task of the Halcyon man, who will give birth to stars, that is, who will see that which is coming towards us from that which has been from the old, a future that remains hidden from the shadow hunters. Die Not ist notwendig, sagt Nietzsche. Hardship is necessary, Nietzsche says. All the best.